Back in the winter of 1884, the prairie stretched out like a wound, raw and exposed under a sky the color of old bruises. Hannah lived on the edge of that wound, in a cabin that felt less like shelter and more like a box dropped carelessly into the vast, indifferent emptiness. The wind was her constant companion, a mournful, keening thing that found every crack and seam in the rough-hewn logs, whispering of endless distances and the relentless passage of time. She had come here with her husband, Thomas, full of a hope that felt naive in retrospect, a fragile flower blooming briefly before the harsh sun and biting winds withered it to dust. They built the cabin with their own hands, cleared the land, dreamed of crops and children. The dream had splintered. Thomas had been taken by a swift fever 3 years past, leaving her alone with the silence and the ghosts. The child had been taken before him, a tiny, unnamed presence that had barely drawn breath before being swallowed by the earth. Grief settled in her bones like the perpetual chill of the prairie winter, a heavy shroud that numbed her days. Hannah was 34 years old, but the mirrors she rarely looked into showed a woman etched with lines of hardship and sorrow that added years to her face. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders perpetually slightly stooped from work and carrying an unseen weight. She moved through her days in a rhythm of necessity, feeding the chickens, milking the cow, chopping wood, mending clothes, always watching the horizon with eyes that saw little beyond the endless, unchanging sameness. Loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that the wind seemed to whistle through. She spoke few words aloud, mostly commands to the cow or murmurs to the fire. The nearest settlement, Harmony Creek, was a day's hard ride away, a place where pity felt like judgment and solitude felt safer than navigating the complex, wary gazes of people who saw her as either tragic or simply peculiar. She was the widow Hannah, the woman who lived alone out on the flats, spoken of in low tones, mostly left alone, and that suited her. Being alone meant fewer chances for the world to inflict new wounds. One afternoon, late in the year when the wind sharpened its edge and the sky threatened snow, Hannah was mending a tier in the cabin roof. It was tedious work, her fingers stiff with cold. She paused, flexing them, and scanned the horizon out of habit. That was when she saw it, a smudge against the pale gold of the dry grass, moving. It was small, not much bigger than a deer fawn. Her first thought was a lost calf perhaps, but as it drew closer, stumbling rather than running, a flicker of unease traced its way up her spine. It was a human shape, a child. Panic was a cold, unfamiliar sensation. Children didn't wander out here alone, not white children from the settlement. And the shape, even from this distance, wasn't right for a white child bundled against the cold. It was too slight, too dark. She scrambled down from the roof, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the old Winchester rifle from its rack by the door, its familiar weight a small comfort in her trembling hands. She wasn't afraid of the child itself, but of what its presence meant. The tribes were mostly on reservations now, pushed further west, but stories persisted. Skirmishes, raids, misunderstandings that turned deadly. A lone native child out here, it spoke of trouble. She watched from the doorway as the figure faltered, stumbled, and fell. It didn't get up. A moment of rigid stillness held her, the rifle clutched tight. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to bar the door, to pretend she hadn't seen. This was not her concern. This was danger. But the child didn't move. The wind whipped around the small, still form. It was utterly exposed, vulnerable. A different kind of cold washed over Hannah, one that had nothing to do with the biting wind. It was the cold memory of her own child, helpless and fragile, fading away. A child, alone and hurt. It didn't matter what color their skin was, or what tribe they belonged to. It was a child. She lowered the rifle slowly. Setting it just inside the door, she pulled her heavy shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the biting wind. She approached cautiously, eyes scanning the horizon instinctively for any sign of others. The child lay face down in the dry grass, a small bundle of rags and dirt. As she knelt, she saw the dark braid, the small, still hand, reaching towards nothing. She gently rolled the child over. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8. His face was thin, smeared with dirt and dried blood. His breathing was shallow, ragged. A dark stain bloomed on the makeshift bandage tied around his left leg, and his foot was twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were closed, lashes stark against his pale, drawn skin. He was dressed in worn buckskin, clearly not clothing meant for the sharp cold of a prairie autumn turning towards winter. He looked utterly spent, ravaged by exhaustion and pain. Hannah knelt there for a long moment, the wind tearing at her clothes, tugging at her hair. Here was a creature of the world, broken and alone, dropped onto her doorstep by fate or desperation. This was not the silent, manageable grief she was accustomed to. This was immediate, demanding, frightening. She couldn't leave him. The thought was simple, stark, overriding every caution. She couldn't leave him to die in the dirt, not a child. Gathering her strength, she carefully scooped the small body into her arms. He was frighteningly light. A low moan escaped his lips as she adjusted him. His skin felt unnaturally warm against her cheek. She carried him back to the cabin, the wind pushing against her, as if trying to wrestle him away, to keep him for the prairie's own. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the faint, ever-present smell of damp earth. She laid the boy gently on the narrow cot that had once been Thomas's. For a moment, she just stood over him, watching his labored breathing, the rise and fall of his thin chest. Her mind raced, a jumble of fears and uncertainties. Who was he? Where had he come from? Were others looking for him? Was she putting herself in terrible danger? Pushing the questions aside, she moved to the fireplace, stirring the embers back to life. She heated water, found clean rags, and pulled out the small, worn medical kit Thomas had kept. Her hands, though calloused, were steady now, focused by purpose. She worked slowly, carefully cutting away the blood-soaked bandage from his leg. The wound beneath was deep, festering. He whimpered, but didn't fully wake. His ankle was clearly broken, swollen and bruised. Fever burned hot beneath his skin. Washing the wound, bandaging it, carefully splinting the ankle, the tasks were familiar, echoes of time she had tended to Thomas after a ranching accident. But this was different. This was a child, a stranger, an other in the eyes of her world. And he was so clearly hurt, so vulnerable. She gave him a few sips of water, which he swallowed reflexively, before he drifted back into a restless, fevered sleep. Hannah sat beside the cot, watching him, the rifle forgotten by the door. The silence of the cabin felt different now, no longer just empty, but filled with the presence of this small, fragile life. The questions returned, circling like buzzards. What would she do when he woke? What would she do when others came looking? Days blurred into a quiet, tense routine. The boy, whose name she learned was Takakota through gestures and a few softly spoken words in a language she didn't understand, remained feverish. Hannah nursed him tirelessly. She brewed willow bark tea for the fever, cleaned and rebandaged his wound, spoon-fed him thin broth. She rarely slept, constantly checking his breathing, smoothing the damp hair from his forehead. He was wary when he was lucid, his dark eyes watching her with a mixture of fear and something that might have been curiosity. He didn't speak her language, and her few attempts at sign language, learned years ago from a passing trapper, were clumsy and likely misunderstood. Communication was limited to gestures, quiet sounds, and the shared understanding of need and care. The cabin, once a tomb of her grief, was now a crucible of sorts. The boy's presence was a disruption, a demand on her attention that pulled her out of the stagnant pool of her sorrow. She found herself moving with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. The isolation was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was now a fragile bubble protecting them from the outside world. Takakota, when the fever finally broke and his eyes cleared, was quieter than any child she had ever known. He ate what she offered, watched her with those deep, intelligent eyes, and slowly, tentatively, began to move around the cabin as his ankle healed. He learned simple things: the word water, the gesture for hungry, the names of a few objects. He would sit by the fireplace, carving small shapes from bits of wood with a sharp stone he had somehow kept hidden. He moved with a grace that was foreign to her world, silent and observant, like a creature of the wilderness. Hannah, in turn, watched him. She saw the resilience in his small body, the quiet strength in his gaze. She saw not an enemy child as the fearful whispers in Harmony Creek might label him, but a boy who had been hurt, who was far from home, who carried his own unspoken burdens. She saw the way his eyes sometimes held a flicker of deep sadness, a reflection of her own loss. In the quiet shared space of the cabin, the barriers of language and culture began to seem less like walls and more like thin veils. He never spoke of where he came from, and she didn't ask, respecting the silence. She knew only that he was alone, that he was injured, and that she had brought him in. That was enough. Slowly, tentatively, a rhythm developed between them. He helped her with chores that didn't require his healing ankle, sorting beans, stripping dry corn cobs, polishing the few pieces of worn furniture. She showed him how to mend cloth with needle and thread, and he showed her how to make fire using only flint and steel, a skill she found both fascinating and humbling. One evening, as the first snow fell softly outside, blanketing the prairie in white, they sat by the fire. Hannah was patching a worn blanket. Takakota was finishing a small, smooth bird carving. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the soft rustle of her needle. He finished the carving, examining it critically. Then, with a quiet movement, he held it out to her. Hannah paused, looking from the small wooden bird to his face. His expression was open, unguarded. It was a gift, a true gift given freely, without expectation. Her throat tightened. She took the carving, her fingers closing around the smooth wood. It was simple, beautiful. "Thank you," she murmured, the words feeling stiff and unused. He watched her, a faint hint of a smile touching his lips. That small, shared moment, the simple act of giving and receiving, felt like a dam breaking. It wasn't just about providing shelter and care anymore. It was about seeing each other, two solitary souls finding a fragile thread of connection in the vastness. The bond between them deepened, forged in shared silence, small acts of kindness, and mutual reliance. Hannah felt a thawing in the frozen landscape of her heart. Takakota's quiet presence filled some of the empty spaces the wind used to howl through. She found herself looking forward to his small, rare smiles, to the way he watched her with growing trust. She told him stories, simple ones about the animals or the weather, knowing he understood little of the words but perhaps sensing the rhythm and the intent. But the outside world was still there, a simmering threat beyond the thin walls of the cabin. News from Harmony Creek traveled slowly but inevitably. Whispers of missing children from a recent raid, of settlers on edge, of growing animosity towards any native presence. Hannah knew, with a cold certainty, that Takakota's presence in her home would not be welcomed. If anyone found out, it would bring trouble she couldn't face alone. The external conflict arrived not like a storm, but like a slow, creeping chill. It began with a rider, a man named Brody from the settlement, known for his loud opinions and distrust of anyone different. He stopped by the cabin, supposedly checking on her, but his eyes darted everywhere, sharp and assessing. He asked too many questions about whether she had seen anyone pass by, any strangers. Hannah kept her answers short, her face impassive, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. Takakota was hidden in the small root cellar beneath the floorboards. Brody left, but his visit felt like a shadow lingering. Hannah knew she hadn't fooled him. He was suspicious. And suspicion, in a place like this, could turn dangerous quickly. Weeks later, the true threat materialized. It was early spring, the prairie beginning to shed its winter pallor, when 3 riders approached the cabin, kicking up dust. Brody was among them, flanked by 2 other men from the settlement, their faces grim and determined. They rode up to the cabin and dismounted, their movements deliberate, their hands resting near their rifles. Hannah stepped out onto the small porch, her heart sinking. There was no hiding now. Takakota was inside, near the fire. His splint long removed, his ankle mostly healed. He had heard the horses, she knew. He was probably watching her through the window, silent and afraid. Brody stepped forward, his gaze hard. "Afternoon, Hannah," he said, though there was no warmth in his voice. "Heard tell you might be keepin' secrets out here." Hannah met his gaze steadily, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I keep to myself, Brody, you know that." "Aye, you do," he sneered. "But folks in town are talking about a missing boy, a native boy, one of the ones from the trouble up north." He gestured vaguely. The implication hung heavy in the air. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hannah said, her voice quiet but firm. One of the other men, a burly man with a scarred face, spat on the ground near her feet. "Don't lie, widow. We know you took him in. Someone saw smoke when your chimney shouldn't have been burnin' low these past months." and little Timmy Miller swears he saw a glimpse of something dark through your window last time his pa rode by." Hannah's stomach clenched. Timmy Miller, barely 7, given to wild tales. But in their fear and anger, these men would believe anything. Brody took another step closer. "Hand him over, Hannah. He belongs with us. He's one of them, after what they did." His voice trailed off, filled with bitter hatred. He was likely talking about the raid he'd mentioned, the cause of the missing boy they sought. Takakota's tribe, or one nearby, must have been involved. The sins of some were being visited upon the innocent. "He's a child," Hannah said, finding her voice again, stronger this time. "He was hurt, alone, dying." "He's a savage," the scarred man roared, raising his rifle slightly. "Lower your weapon, Cal," Brody said, but his eyes never left Hannah. "We ain't here for trouble, Hannah. Just hand over the boy. He'll be taken to where he needs to be." He didn't say captured, didn't say punished, but the unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. This was the moment. The choice was stark, terrifying. Hand over the child who had, in these quiet months, chipped away at the ice around her heart, the child who looked at her with trust. Or stand against these men, against the fear and prejudice they represented, against the brutal code of their world. Standing against them meant danger. It meant likely losing her home, perhaps worse. But handing over Takakota, it meant extinguishing the fragile spark of connection she had found, betraying the trust she had, however reluctantly, earned. It meant letting fear win. She looked at the cabin door, then back at the hard faces of the men. There was no hesitation in her now. The numbness of grief had been replaced by something fierce and protective. This wasn't just about Takakota anymore. It was about the choice between cruelty and kindness, between fear and courage, between the dead weight of the past and the fragile possibility of a future. She drew herself up, pulling the shawl tight, her shoulders straightening. She stood taller than she had in years. "Get off my land," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she hadn't known she possessed. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a whip. Brody looked taken aback. "Hannah, you can't protect him. He's not your kind. He's one of them." "He's a boy," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "And he's under my roof. I found him hurt. I cared for him. He stays here." Cal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You gone soft in the head out here alone, widow, protectin' a little redskin." He raised his rifle higher. "We'll just take him. Don't make this hard." Hannah didn't flinch. "You want him," she said, her voice low and steady. "You'll have to go through me." She stood squarely in the doorway, blocking the entrance to her home, to the child within. She wasn't armed, save for the knowledge of the rifle just inside. But her stance, her resolute eyes, spoke volumes. She was no longer just the lonely widow. She was a shield, a boundary they would have to cross. Brody hesitated. He hadn't expected this. He had expected her to be scared, perhaps to cry, certainly to yield. This quiet strength, this defiant stand, threw him. Cal was itching for a confrontation, his face contorted with anger and prejudice. But even he paused, perhaps surprised by the absolute conviction in Hannah's voice. The wind swirled around them, carrying the scent of dust and new grass. It felt like the prairie itself held its breath, watching. "Step aside, Hannah," Brody warned, his voice strained. "No," she said simply. They stood there for a long, tense moment, the air thick with unspoken threats and unwavering resolve. Then, from inside the cabin, came a small sound. A floorboard creaked. Takakota. He must have heard everything. Hannah's heart ached. He was a child, caught in the crossfire of adult hatred. But seeing him in her mind's eye, seeing his quiet trust, seeing the small wooden bird carving on her shelf inside, solidified her stance. There was no going back. Brody exchanged a look with Cal and the other man. They hadn't anticipated a fight, not really. Just a scared woman they could easily intimidate. Hannah wasn't scared. Or if she was, her fear was eclipsed by something stronger. Facing down a determined, potentially armed woman protecting her home felt different than cornering a vulnerable target. It felt complicated and public. Even out here, people talked. They respected resilience, even grudgingly. And they disliked unnecessary bloodshed, especially involving a woman and a child, even a native one, if it could be avoided without looking weak. Brody's face hardened. "This ain't over, Hannah. "The boy can't stay here forever. Folks ain't gonna forget." "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," she said, her voice calm. He stared at her for another beat, his gaze sharp, calculating. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he turned. "Let's go," he muttered to the others. "No point in making a scene today." Cal grumbled under his breath, giving Hannah a venomous look, but he turned his horse. The three men remounted, their movements stiff with thwarted intent. Brody gave Hannah one last look, a promise of future trouble in his eyes, then turned his horse as well. They rode away, their figures shrinking against the vast landscape, eventually disappearing over a rise. Hannah stood on the porch until the last trace of dust settled, her legs shaky, her heart still pounding. The immediate danger had passed, but Brody was right, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. She turned slowly and stepped back inside the cabin, closing the door firmly behind her. Takakota was standing by the fireplace, watching her, his eyes wide. He had understood more than she thought, perhaps sensing the danger and her defiance. He looked small and fragile, but there was a quiet strength in his gaze that mirrored her own newfound resolve. She walked towards him, kneeling down. For the first time since he had arrived, she reached out and gently pulled him into an embrace. He was stiff at first, unused to such closeness, then slowly, tentatively, his small arms wrapped around her neck. In that quiet moment, the last vestiges of her frozen grief seemed to crack and fall away. The emptiness was still there, the pain of what she had lost, but it was no longer a void. It was a space that could be filled, not replaced, but overlaid with the warmth of a different kind of connection. She had stood against her world for him, she had chosen. The denouement unfolded not in dramatic events, but in the quiet continuity of days. Brody and his men did not return immediately. The threat lingered, a dark cloud on the horizon, but for the moment, there was peace within the cabin walls. Hannah and Takakota settled into a new, deeper rhythm. The silence between them was no longer wary, but comfortable, companionable. They communicated through a mixture of her halting English, his few words of the same, gestures, and a language born of shared looks and understanding. Takakota showed her plants on the prairie, their uses for food or medicine, knowledge passed down through generations. Hannah taught him more English words, taught him to read the few books she possessed, stories of distant lands and brave heroes that filled their evenings by the fire. His ankle healed completely, and he moved with the effortless grace she had first observed. He helped her with all the chores now, his small hands surprisingly capable. They worked side by side, planting a small garden, mending the fences, preparing for the next harsh winter. The cabin felt different, no longer just a place of solitary survival, but a home, small and precarious, but a home nonetheless. The prejudice of the outside world remained, a constant, low-grade threat. Hannah knew they couldn't hide forever. Takakota was growing, his presence harder to conceal. But the fear that had gripped her initially had lessened, replaced by a quiet determination. She had faced down the initial storm, and in doing so, had found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She was no longer defined by her loss, but by her choice, by the life she was building, day by day, with this child who had been delivered to her. They rode into Harmony Creek together one summer day. It was a calculated risk, one they had discussed through simple words and gestures. Takakota wore clothes Hannah had made for him, looking perhaps like any other dark-haired boy, but his features, his quiet dignity, marked him as different. Hannah held her head high, Takakota riding beside her on the old mare, his small hand resting on the saddle. The reaction was mixed. Some averted their eyes, uncomfortable. Some stared, their faces hardening with suspicion and disapproval. Brody was in front of the saloon, his jaw tightening as he saw them. But others, a few of the women, an older storekeeper who had known Thomas, offered tentative nods, small smiles. Hannah bought supplies, spoke briefly, efficiently. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize, she simply existed, with Takakota by her side. It was an assertion, a quiet defiance. This is who we are now, deal with it. They rode back to the cabin, leaving the whispers and stares behind. The prairie welcomed them back, vast and silent. Life was still hard, the prairie was still unforgiving. But Hannah was no longer just enduring, she was living. Takakota's presence had cracked open the world she had shut herself into, letting in not just the light, but the challenges and the joys that came with connection. She had saved him, perhaps. But in doing so, he had saved her too, pulling her back from the brink of her own self-imposed exile. The future was uncertain. There would likely be more challenges, more confrontations with the world's fear and prejudice. But as Hannah watched Takakota, laughing quietly as he chased a grasshopper through the tall stalks near the cabin, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. The desolate wound of the prairie still stretched around them, but in their small cabin, on that lonely patch of land, a different kind of bloom had begun, fragile but resilient, a testament to the unexpected ways connection could heal and the quiet power of standing tall against the storm for another soul.